tonight. So just to level set a little bit, how many people here do things with, I guess, what you consider traditional front ends? Couple, back ends, full stack, blur the lines, everyone? Okay, so that's what really HTMX is all about. One of the reasons why HTMX, I was really excited about that is there's so much, how can you say, like predetermined types of things about like front end and back end, especially front end. Like anytime you talk full stack, people say, "Oh, what are you doing in your front end? Are you a React guy? Are you still doing Angular? Are you doing all these things?" It seems to be that there's this perception that anytime you talk about front end or full stack, you have to include a JavaScript language because, of course, that's the only way to make things dynamic, right? That's the only way to have a SPA or a single page application and those types of things. So hopefully, if nothing else that comes out of like some of the talks and examples tonight, we break that paradigm a little bit. And before you go into your next project, maybe you stop and pause right there and think, okay, maybe would this be a use case for HTMX? And hopefully get rid of like lots of the gobbledygook and overcomplication that the JavaScript frameworks tend to bring. So first off, what is HTMX? It's hypertext markup extension. Really, it's just a JavaScript library. That's all it is. So it's not a framework per se, like React or Vue or Nuxt, Svelte, any of these things. But it does give you a couple things. So if you're considering using HTMX, some things to know about it is that it is dynamic HTML, meaning you can update content on your page, like where applicable, without needing to refresh, which is like the biggest kind of concept about the SPAs, right? Because God forbid you hit a refresh button or you click a next page and have to like refresh a thing. It is very minimal. It's one single JavaScript library that's extremely lightweight, and it gives you a collection of HTML attributes that you can put directly into your HTMX code without the need of additional things. A lot of the handling of everything like DOM manipulation, AJAX calls and all that are very, very simple with just simple attributes, and it's all abstracted away for you. So you don't have to write, like, for example, custom JavaScript functions to parse out like a parameter of a thing and build a payload and send it out and then wait for something to come back, and all that is also all taken care of for you. So one of the big things that really attracted me to HTMX overall when I first got introduced to it, it was kind of promoted to me as like a JavaScript library to not have to do JavaScript, which is awesome. So almost everyone raised their hand when I talked about like full stack, front end, back end. How many people here actually like doing JavaScript? Okay, well, one and maybe a half over there. So, but how many people like doing the language that you actually enjoy, whether it be Go, Python, dare I say Ruby, whatever, in the back? And most people want to do more of that type of code. And one of the great things about using HTMX is you move a lot of that functionality to quote unquote backend, even if it's not really backend, and you can do much less JavaScript and everything gets greatly simplified. So some of the core concepts of HTMX is almost everything is an AJAX request. So get, post, you do a thing, hit some endpoint, you get some code back that you can put directly into your DOM. So all the things that will trigger that action or tend to be on the client side, meaning in your browser, you click a button, you follow a link, you do like an on load, on hover, things like that. To be able to trigger something that's going to happen on said endpoint. Most importantly is there's no JSON rendering unless you really want to do that. The most typical example is, you hit an endpoint, you get a blob of HTML, formatted or unformatted, that you inject directly into some tag on your HTML itself. Which is the next point where it's like directly injected into like a tag identified by ID. And there's a number of like different things you can use for swapping content in and out. So you don't have to just like replace an entire div. For example, you can say if you have a list or like maybe you're working on a to-do app or something like that, or you have a number of ordered, unordered list, you can inject something at the top, at the bottom, replace it all together and do a lot of interesting things like that. So when we talk about JavaScript frameworks, I hear a lot of people talk about, oh, here's all the things that you get. You get a state management. You get all of my React components. You get all this and you get all that. What I think is really important about, or one of the main features of HTMX is all the things you don't get or don't have or don't need. Things like custom JavaScript functions, a whole bunch of extra libraries and imports that like muck up your HTML. JSON parsing, state management, re-rendering of a virtual DOM, and all that kind of stuff. And these last 4 bullet points kind of all go together. It's like you don't have like a fragmented experience where you have separate front end and back end. Like I think a lot of people more like quote unquote back end side of things. Like how many times have you maybe developed an app and you have a whole bunch of APIs that I got all the CRUD stuff covered. You can do all these things. Front end person, go for it. And they're like, well, no, I don't want to make multiple calls. So give me a custom API to do the thing I exactly want to do. Or, well, I don't want to use an auth token. I need to use a JOT or these types of things. So the CORS headers aren't working right. All this kind of stuff. All that goes away by using HTMX, just because you don't have that fragmented experience. So some of the things you do have is a collection of attributes and triggers, and this is not a comprehensive list by any means, but these are probably the most basic things that you're going to look at. And if you go to htmx.org/docs, you can see like all the stuff, and it's all pretty straightforward to go through. But you do get all of the basic HTTP verbs. So you get your put, patch, delete, all that kind of stuff you can do directly in your HTML. You get a concept of a target. So by default, and we'll look at some examples in just a minute, when you do some things, you can like replace the div that you're currently working in, or you can give an ID to say do something somewhere else. Like you can click a button, then have some content be injected somewhere. You have a number of different swap things you can do, like inner HTML, outer HTML, before, after, end of list, these types of things. And you also have a collection of different triggers. So a simple example is like, here's a button or here's the link, you click a thing, you get a content, it does something, but you can also do like on page load, on mouse over, on trigger, on time, all kinds of different stuff like that. So that, again, whole comprehensive list on their website itself. And one other example, the different one to put out there is like a concept of an out-of-bounds swap. So we talked about being able to like swap out, like say like one div. You can actually do multiple swaps and things outside of the targeted ID if you want to have some additional things like a counter or notification or whatnot. And we'll look at some examples of those. So here's a very, very simple example. Hopefully it shows up pretty well. So this is like a full, I guess, website, you can say. We do have an import here. We're just having this one HTMX package. Over here, we have a button with an HX attribute of HX get, HX target, and HX swap. And down here, I have highlighted just like one div of contents. So if I clicked this button, it would go to this endpoint to get some kind of payload that would then get injected into the HTMX target, which would be here. And in this case, we're swapping the outer HTML, which means it'll grab this whole outer div, meaning the div with the ID content and everything inside. The default is inner HTML, where we'd only do things inside that div. So I think that's a good overview. I wanted to share like a real world example. These are not my numbers or anything, but this came from a talk at DjangoCon, I think in 2022, maybe 2021. And I guess the exercise of this was so good that it's actually published as an essay, and there's a YouTube video as well on the HTMX like website. But I do want to highlight a couple of things here. In this project they did, they had a React website, because everyone knows you have to have React to have an dynamic site, right? And a Django backend. And they took 2 months and had a code base of about 21 lines of code, mostly in JavaScript. And this is the result of their experience of taking that, ditching React, and using HTMX instead. So a couple of the things highlighted here that I wanted to share is like they reduced the overall code base by 67%. So from like 21,000 lines to 7,000 lines, about, which is hugely significant. Any one of these points, I think, would be a huge reason and justification to move to HTMX, but there's many of these points. Number five. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
The total JavaScript dependencies.
Yes, that, yeah. Again, any one of these is super huge. Oops. Get to that one in a minute. Yeah, I don't want to jump on it too much. So obviously, with the reduction of JavaScript code, there was a slight increase in the Python code, but of course, everyone here likes to do their backend technology of choice, so I would say that's a very, very good thing. Reduced dependencies, reduced build time, reduced memory usage, all of that stuff. And one thing that didn't make it on here is that they also were able to reduce the headcount because their JavaScript person was like, okay, well, I don't need to be here, and they left. Okay, so I hit that button a little bit too early, but this is also for that same talk and that same essay, which I think just not only highlights a technology stack like HTMX as much, but so many other things like in the tech industry. Again, like, can I get a shout out for like Terraform or poetry or all these other ridiculous things that solve stuff for you. So what I really like about this slide is it kind of shows like the cyclical nature of technology in general and how, yeah, you know what, back in 2004, everything just kind of worked. And then we had JavaScript, that was great. And then we had jQuery, and then we had to get Angular, and then we had to get React, and then Vue, and React wasn't enough. So then you need what, Remix, Redux, Redo, whatever, whatever, all these other add-ons to make the things work the way we wanted them to work. And now all of a sudden here it is, well, this came from 2021, but we're in 2024, all the way back to where we started, which is like the things that it should have been from the first place. So anyway, I like this one. Obviously they have the trolls on there, but I think it's a perfect state of like why you might want to use HTMX instead of a JavaScript framework. So that said, let's actually pull up some code and look at some examples. I do have a repo that if you want to follow along, you can. If not, you can reference it later if that's of interest to you. And if we have time, we can actually go into SpokaneTech.org. That's what Joe was mentioning earlier. So those of us who have contributed on there, there is some HTMX in there. So if you want to see some examples, we can look some of those live. So
you might have to reshare your screen because I think you want to share the browser. Teams.
Oh.
For the online people.
For online people, okay. Let me see how to do Teams things. Stop sharing. So if I share like is there an entire desktop option?
Yeah.
Screen, I guess. Someone on Teams, does that look like you're seeing everything?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So I'm going to go ahead and clone this repo, and we'll start all the way from scratch, and we'll look at some slow in there. Okay, so and because it's Python, I'm going to start with a virtual environment. So I'm going to create that. And this is slow when we're on here, I guess. And then I'm going to activate it and then install my requirements. So in this case, it's going to be like a Django-based example with like a couple extra things in there. And from there, we can jump into some code and show some real examples. So I'm going to cp into a Django project here, and just so you can see what that looks like. It's very simple. It's a couple of examples. Let's go ahead and open up VS Code, and we're going to bounce back and forth between some code and some examples in the browser itself, if this is large enough to share. So let me go ahead and launch that. And to start like a local Django project, you can use like the manage command and do run server. And that should start a server on port 8080 or 8000 rather. And we should be able to look at some things in there. So this is a couple very simple examples we have here. So we'll start with one, and then we'll look at the code that actually does that. So click to get data. So this is kind of like that example I showed earlier, where there's literally a button. We're going to click a button. Something's going to happen. We'll get some new content, and then that will be displayed on the site. And then we'll look at how that works. So in this case, I'm going to get a Chuck Norris joke. So if anyone had to guess, if I hit that button, what's going to happen?
That's future home.
Let's find out. See if this worked. All right, hey, look, we got a Chuck Norris joke. And the page didn't refresh. Amazing. So I did put a couple prints here in the code just so we can see what's happening. If we can make this a little bit. That's what happens when I don't have a real mouse. All right, well, I'm just gonna do it. So anytime I click this joke or button, we should see that we get a new joke, and that somehow it's doing something on the server side, and we're getting some amazing jokes out of there. So if we look at the code, let's go ahead and look at the example for that, and get rid of all these. hopefully that's not too horrible to fit on here. Yes, my. So what we'll see here, let me make this a little bit smaller. So what we'll see here is, doing some imports. The main thing, of course, is HTMX. I also put Bootstrap in here just so we have a little bit of styling. So we have a button. This has an HTMX get, which is going to hit some endpoint. That's like literally get joke. And we have a target of content, which is identified down here as the feature home of an amazing Chuck Norris joke. So what this does in the background is, if we look at, for example, the code, and for those who don't do a lot of Django, the actual thing that gets rendered is called a view. So if we go into this view, we call a partial down here into our get joke function. This calls this API, grabs the text, and returns that to the quote unquote front end, which is really just the HTML code. In this case, what you'll notice here is this HTTP response is returning plain text. That's literally just a string that we're giving in there and putting into that div. So nothing like too fancy there, although we can actually do things with actual rendered and styled text. So you can include CSS in there. You can include any other things that you want in there. And our next example, we'll see an example of that. So if I go back to our start page and say, actually, this one, let's look at the code first, and you guys can tell me what you think is going to happen. So for my example 2, again, this is just importing a couple things here, HTMX, basically the same stuff. And down here, we have something a little bit different. Let me just put in some returns here to do that. So we have a different type of trigger. We're not, clicking the button. We're going to do something that's called HX trigger that says every 3S. And down here, there's another one that says every 5S. So who wants to take a guess about what might happen with this code?
5 seconds. The get request and run agree. Seconds.
Okay, that's a pretty good guess. Everyone thinks like Seth's right, Seth's wrong. Okay, I'm gonna say that everyone thinks that Seth's right. So let's look at that. Oh, hey, thanks, Joe. Sorry. So something magically happened. I did exactly nothing other than loading the site, and now somehow, magically, things are getting updated. In this case, it's just a timestamp, but you can see that's 2 different lines, and every so often. Oh, hey, logic, look at that. And it doesn't want to. I have to click it to start it. Well, okay, whatever. It's fine. It's fine. So. It's a ladder, right? Yeah. So the interesting thing about this is it is, in this case, returning a partial. Let's look at the view. In this case, returning in this case, excuse me. So instead of returning just plain text, it is doing a render, which means that there's, in this case, a partial, which is an HTML or HTML document. I'm putting in a timestamp into that context that gets rendered. So we can see that we actually have some styling. So this HTML with styling, in this case, it's just like a Bootstrap property that you can see that's going in there. But if I wanted to change something, like maybe not use a secondary color and use like a danger color, next time that goes, now all of a sudden it's red. So you can see that the styling of that is actually being applied as well. And again, I'm doing exactly almost nothing on the front end. It just somehow HTMX itself knows that when you give that trigger of every X seconds, it does something there. So you're probably thinking this would be a great example of how to build like a dashboard or a notification or something like that. So this is a very good way of using something like that. Steve.
I have a question about error states.
I didn't even think about including error states.
Yeah, and you're on that.
Yes. So, okay. So if I'm on here, what you're asking is if I put the right button. Well, that's okay. We can use this. So if I kill this, because you see right here, from the print statements that were in that every time. So you're wondering what's going to happen here. And the answer is, anyone? So the front end, meaning the browser, is still trying to send something every X seconds, but there's nothing to reply. So it'll do literally nothing. So no error state, no timeout, no blank gobbledygook or anything like that, just like literally nothing, which in a lot, don't quote me on that, but I do believe that for most HTMX calls, if there is an error or something like that, it will return and do nothing by default. I think you have to change a little bit something there if you want a different type of behavior. Yeah. Yeah, I'd have to consult the docs to see exactly what that is. Yes, so like by default, if it's like a non-200, then it will like not do the swap. And let's put that to a test a little bit and see if like this comes back up. And hey, look, we didn't refresh the page or anything, and all of a sudden, like our timestamps are getting updated yet again.
Is whatever gets rendered on the screen auto HTMX? Like if you return HTMX tags in your partial, they automatically get parsed by HTMX and become part of the state.
So there's not really a concept of state, so to say.
What's currently in the browser, HTMX takes that up. Like if you copy that it does.
Yeah.
No, but I understand your question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I like that question.
It does, Brendan. It
Okay, wow.
yeah. So when it replaces that HTML, part of how this works, right? It's like HATEOS, right? So you're returning actual HTML. You put that in, and then any of those HTML tags get parsed. So a very common pattern with HTMX is you swap something and you provide HTML that has a new HTMX target that has a new a new action. And then that becomes the action of that block of HTML. Okay. So that's a lot of what you're doing is you're just swapping HTML and you're using HTML as your state rather than JSON.
We try something.
Sure. What?
So your example 2 that you've got up there, if you copy one of those mobs out of example 2 and put it in your get time, will that create like a recursive loop inside of HTMX that will just start pounding your server and just like asking it for the time a million times?
So I mean,
So if you put one of the blocks that requests it every 3 seconds into this HTML.
I don't know. Let's find out. Let's just do it.
Yeah.
So you're saying if I took this entire thing like here, let's say every 3 second, like this div here, right? And put this into my
You'd have to.
Oh,
It swaps it out. Yeah. So unless you return 2 of them, or unless you netted it wrong in your reply, it completely replaces it.
So this get time blob should completely replace what's in here for this, which is if we did and it does inner HTML by because we do inner HTML by default. So that should put that nested thing in there. I mean, should we try to break it? All right. Let's see what happens. So something different is definitely happening at this point in time, but yours.
For a second. Oh, the second one it does 3 seconds and then 5 seconds.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be more than that, but
Well, you certainly could make it.
All right. So let's move on to the next example, but I need to back up one step because I forgot to do something. So for Django, we're actually going to do something with the database. So I need to run migrations to actually put that structure in place. And I need to create a user to be able to log in because I want to show that we're actually creating a record on something. So I'm going to just do that real quick. Yes, so we should be good to go from there. Let's go ahead and restart the server. And this will make sense in just a moment. So for example 3, I have a simple submission thing because you can use HTMX to submit form data and things like that. In this case, I wanted to create a record of like literally just data and see that we could use this for confirmation. So if I said like test 1 and submitted that, we can see almost instantly that we had submitted test data, and that created a record in our database. So let me go ahead and open up one more window here and go to our admin page for those who aren't super into Django. It also gives you a admin page where you can like see all of your things. What's my password? All right. So in this case, I just have one simple model, which is a database table. And that entry that I set in the form of remarkably interesting data of test 1 is now there. And if I did like another one of like test 2, sent that, for example, something weird happens. Did I do there? That's submit the form. Let's try it again. 3, send that. Then I should have some data in my database. So I'm just looking at this admin interface to verify that these records were indeed created. So that's a simple example of just like submitting data from a form. Obviously, if you have like more extensive form, you can do more interesting things. But what's being updated here is just a example of what was confirmed to be put in the database and the timestamp of that. So for the last example, let's go back to the code, and I want to show example 4. So this one is almost the same as example 3, except we added one little thing here for a record counts. So let's look at that, and we can see that we have a record count of 2. So who can guess what might happen if I add in one more piece of data? Record count 3. So that's an out-of-band swap. So remember in the first example, we're basically swapping on a div here to put in this confirmation data. And this uses an out-of-band swap to not only do that, but update this count as well. So that's being done by a partial. So this is what's being returned. And this is all it takes to add that extra piece of data there. So in that other page, there's a div of ID record count, and we just add this one thing with this context that we're passing in through the view, and now we have instantaneous counter of records that were being added to that with the combination of that form. Joe.
Instead of creating like a HTML file, can you just return like the normal template? So like say you have like a div with like ID of content, instead of creating a partial that just has the content elements, you just return the normal template and target swapping the ID of your current page with, the div with the ID of content, and just swap it with, like basically just select an element from the response to swap out. Does that make sense?
So let me back up one to example 4. So this is the HTML here, where we have the form, and right here we have another div with the record count. So which part are you referring to?
Yeah, instead of like swapping out the entire, whatever you're replacing, inner HTML, outer HTML, instead of replacing it with all of the HTML that gets returned, basically selecting an element inside the response to replace it. Because then you wouldn't have to write all these partials. You could just like,
You have one page, you take a piece of the page that you want to replace, cut that out and use that as a response.
Exactly.
Functional.
Yeah.
Or like you don't want to write.
I won't write.
Because you want to essentially have the view, it's a page. Return the same template no matter what, but if it's an Ajax request, wow. Have HTMX block just one target from that. However inefficient that will be.
Yes, so that's actually not too inefficient. So here's the Django view. So example 4. So what this does is we're looking for the request method. So if it's not a post, and obviously it should be a little bit more robust than that, like if you're using get and patches and all those types of things. So basically we're saying right here that if it's essentially a get, a non-post, then just reform the context of the form. And if it is a post, then put in the object that we just created. So we get the confirmation and a record counts, which is just a count from the models here. So you can do that with one view.
Yeah, I think he's asking to still return for HTML, have HTMX pull out content from that.
So with an out-of-band swap, I want to say yes.
Yeah, you can. If they have a select attribute, it's on the docs. I have I don't know this pad, I just looked it up because I remember seeing it, but you with the outer band, it does have another element that, or another HX attribute that you can use to say, I want this particular ID of the return to use for the outer band swap. So you can narrow it down based on reply. But the HTMX docs are a great resource, and that's what you mentioned. But they're pretty good at. Yeah,
for sure. So yeah, so for Joe's question, I think if you had something like this and you just took that and put it in, where did my example 4 go? VS Code is good at not keeping things open. If you had like something like this here inside with this out of band swap, I think that might work. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, it's something we definitely play with.
The whole page, then it almost feels like you would rather use like a boost. Like if you do an HX boost, then it swaps out the whole page with the new page that comes back, but it still acts like it doesn't do a full page refresh. It just updates the page. Yeah, with the new stuff in it. It's like if you've got new stuff.
So maybe
Yeah, and then might as well put it in.
And at that point, you've already returned the entire page.
You did all the work already.
So
Yeah.
you're just allowing the client side to cut that out, replace the page. Yeah.
I guess the reason I ask is then you not necessarily, for every form template you have, you create a partial, or it seems like you might have this explosion of templates, but all these partials that are like mirroring the full template. Or I guess if you're using Django, you like include the partial in your base template or something.
You definitely could, and like in other projects I've done that before, where the thing that's going to be the partial for that one, like say record count of this part is actually part of something that you exactly include on like your main templates anyway. So I think that's one of the reasons that HTMX has been very well adopted by the Django community, because things like that work really, really well. Perfect. So that's all the examples I have. I was thinking about going into SpokaneTech.org and showing some there, but I want to make sure that we leave time for Team Go to show us their examples as well. So why don't we pause there? Let Seth take over, and if there's still interest in looking at some of the SpokaneTech.org, I'm going to say that a couple of times just to get the word out. We can look at more of the SpokaneTech.org afterwards.
So that's the talk you referenced earlier. I've seen it. It was really good.
Yes.
And I posted the link to it. And
Excellent. Yeah, definitely a great talk. Probably says a lot of things better than I ever could. So if you're really interested in HTMX, definitely check it out. Again, it was such a good JagoCon talk that they put it on the HTMX website, so you know it's legit. Yes.
So the request, like this form, you can't submit twice, right? Because Django is failing it for a CSRF token.
No, you should be able to do this as many times as you want. See, you can see here that the timestamp is updating. That means we're getting a new record.
Okay.
So I hit that a number of times. If I do, yeah.
I thought maybe the example 3, you were getting it was a CSRF token that was coming there, but
Yes, some weird happened when I turned on the Django admin. I'm not sure what that was, a really weird blip. But yeah, you should be able to hit that submit button as many times as you want forever.
so is it returning a new form and a new token every time you push that submit button?
Yes.
Okay.
So in the view, like for example, let's go back to the view. What it's doing is like after every submit, it's basically doing this part of the code every other time, which means it's re-rendering the form and putting it on the page.
Okay. All right. I think we're good. So I don't have any slides. This is all very code heavy, so I apologize in advance if you're not super familiar with Go. But kind of what I wanted to do was to kind of position how you can use HTMX as sort of common patterns in the Go world when you're developing services and exposing those, to say, okay, typically when you're approaching a Go app, you'll like develop a CLI, or you'll develop an gRPC service or something like that. And it's saying, okay, how can we take the same type of patterns that we would use to do that, but then add a web UI, not for free, but for very with low effort, a lot less effort than trying to figure out how you're going to bootstrap a React app and then where you're going to host it and how you're going to all of that. So what I went ahead and did is put together a super simple service. Actually, I need to start before we go here. It's backed by Nuxt, go figure. So I need to have that running. That's my data store. But it's basically a service that is under typical, repo layout. It's a notebook service. So it basically creates notebooks, lets you put notes into it, stores them all in NATS-KV, and then, has sort of methods for pulling notes out, notebooks out, all the good stuff. So, it's basically a service that you would say, okay, I've created the service. I want to now expose it, make it useful to people. How do I go about doing that? So the first thing I went ahead and did was just wrote a pretty simple CLI for it to basically say, okay, if I'm going to expose this maybe from a CLI, because this is a pretty common pattern in Go, right? Especially in the ops world. Yeah.
Are you able to bump up?
Yes.
Font size or resolution?
There you go. Maybe too much. Yeah, so it's a super, basic CLI, and let's go CLI here. Go build that. We can just say, oops, I can type. And just say CLI, and hey, usage. Get your notebooks, get your notes, and we can say notebooks plus no notebooks found. It could be, add one, list, create. Pretty straightforward, right? It's none of this is difficult because the tooling is all there in the Go world, because this is a very common pattern. You have this. I'm using Fisk as the command line parser, Cobra, Viper. You probably heard of them. Those are other tools that make CLIs very easy to use. All I do is create an instance of this notebook service, by bringing in that package, and I just use that service natively. I haven't written anything in the CLI other than wrapping it in like a terminal UI type of a feel. Pretty straightforward. Same thing with gRPC, right? You can do the exact same thing. Again, all the tooling is there. I did have to write some protobuf, which I put down in here, right? So I didn't do all the correct because it got old after a while, but basically create notebook, get notebooks, you define your protobuf, it compiles it down. Here, that's all we're doing. We're bringing that in, we're registering our server. Again, the workhorse is this notes service. That's where all of the actual business logic is, and we just exposed it over gRPC at this point. So with fairly minimal effort, we wrote our service once. We were able to expose it over the CLI. We were able to expose it over gRPC. That's a very common pattern. We have the service, and we can expose it 2 different ways. So the big problem up until now was always I say that. Massive real. But a very common pattern that was always a problem is this is where the backend development would stop. Hey, I've created a gRPC backend, I've created a CLI, I've exposed my service. You want to access it over the web? Well, then you're going to have to go, your request to JSON. It may have to go through like a gRPC web gateway. Then it's going to have to go to my service, and then I'm going to have to like decouple that, build my model, translate it all back. The rigmarole, that whole thing, and that is just not very much fun. So especially since we already have the note service that does all the work, we already have all that context. And this is kind of the area where that slide about HTMX coming full circle, it reminds me a lot of ways of like the old MVC kind of PHP frameworks, where it's like, you always post to the server, PHP builds the HTML, and it sends the page back. That's essentially what you're doing with HTMX. It's that whole idea of the hypertext is the actual engine of state. That is your state. The back end now is responsible for essentially building the front end, which makes it nice. And it also, there can be some interesting, once you go down that rabbit hole too far, there can be some interesting things. But essentially what we've done with the web then is it's exactly the same type of pattern that you would see with the gRPC or the CLI. We start up a HTTP router. And in this particular case, I'm using Chi. And it's basically the way that we route our incoming requests. But what we're returning is actual HTML. So this is where it gets interesting. How do you write HTML in Go? And that was kind of, I think, the only thing that makes this doable is that there is tooling that allows you to actually get syntax highlighting. It actually allows you to use structs and functions and all of those types of things that you would normally expect to use in Go, but return HTML, and you're not using Go templating. So Go templating, love it for a lot of things. It sucks when you're actually trying to say, hey, I would like to write my, whatever I'm writing in Go template. You usually have to it's just a mess. I don't have any examples for that because I was going to go down that route, and I said, no, I don't want to do that. So this is what basically the handler looks like. And the tooling that we're using right now is this package called Temple. And I will post a link to it, but essentially what Temple is it's a code generator that looks at template functions essentially that can understand what you would think of as typically like React components, right? Not HTMX, what's the React? JSX, yes, essentially like JSX, but then renders it as, it compiles it into Go and then allows you to basically render it. And the cool thing about it is it has all sorts of helper functions. You can just say, hey, I would like to have this component and wrap it in an HTTP handler function. I'll pass you your typical, HTTP writer, and it's off for the races. You can hang that off of structs so that you can actually have your data model suddenly be able to intelligently return HTML about itself. And how that all looks, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, there you go. So how that actually looks is you write template files, and this is what essentially a template file looks like. The VS Code plugin, so template is a, just like you would expect, is a Go binary, but it also has a language server built into it. And so the VS Code plugin, when you have a template file, and you could do this if you're using NVim or whatever, you just have to configure the LSP. But essentially, when the request comes in to validate this file, Temple grabs that, validates itself, then sends it to Go Please, the Go language server, and then gets that all back and returns you an intelligent view of HTML mixed with all sorts of interesting things. So that's really what makes this whole thing possible. And so now this is kind of where the HTMX side of things gets in, because we're going to expose the CLI and the sort of the service over HTML. The workflow, I will caveat this, I did not get a good workflow down because when you're running the template language server and it does all the syntax highlighting, it's compiling it, but it's not saving it. When you want to actually build your Go binary, you have to run temple generate, which will then take this code here, turns it into your actual Go code, and then you compile your binary. This looks horrible. I understand this looks horrible. It's interesting. We can kind of run through, if you're interested in what it's doing, we can kind of run through it. But essentially, it takes, and this is where a split screen would make this easier. But essentially, it takes this line by line, takes a byte buffer, and just shoves stuff into it. So it's running your code and then it's shoving stuff into your byte buffer. Once it gets done, it prints that out. So yes, whatever your feelings are about that, I'll leave it at that. But that's essentially how it works. You write this, it gets compiled into this, and then it just returns your component. So for the actual templates part of things, then let's do this. Let's go ahead and get this started. So we've already done the CLI. Let's do dev go meetup. And I'll put all this code on the in a repo, and I'll post the link to it. But if we go to the web and we build that, we can just go ahead and run that. Yeah, basically, info started. We're listing on 8080. So let's go ahead and.
So that build command work because you had already run the temple generation?
Yes, and if you want to actually, you have to go into, well, sorry, that. So you have to go to, if we were to remove, let's just do that real quick. And then now everything breaks because everything breaks because it doesn't know what it's supposed to actually include. And then that's where you just have to temple generate. And then once that's completed, it'll all start working again. But yes, you have to generate. And that was the comment about the workflow. Make files could make that easier. I'm sure there's probably like save, compile on save things you could do. I'm sure there's probably ways that you could could streamline your workflow, but that was a huge problem, especially for me trying to deal with CSS, which I hate. I don't have a good relationship with it. And so then I was like, oh, I need to change this thing. Now I have to recompile my template, recompile my web server, and restart it. And that's a pain in the butt. Yeah.
Actually, I think that like, and there's no like dev server for this at all. So like basically, if you want to change it, there's no hardware there.
Yeah, I mean, Go is an interesting. There are tools or packages that you can use that will watch for file change within your Go structure and then recompile. So I mean, I've done that before with other projects where you wrap your actual in dev mode, you wrap your running code in a thing that will recompile it, hot refresh for you. But yeah, natively, there's not really anything you can do to get like a hot refresh type of because it's all compiled is the thing.
Does temp have support for like piecemeal compiling, so you're not compiling all of your templates every time?
Yes, it has. I would say just you're gonna have to look at the docs. I didn't dig into it. So I mean, you can do some crazy stuff with it. Like you can actually implement, the components on your structs themselves. You can do functional, type returns. I mean, it's pretty crazy what it can do and pretty flexible. Yeah, I was kind of balancing the idea of like HTMX for me, because I'm mostly a backend developer, was kind of a head trip to get around. Like, how am I going to swap out the target and not like, and make the form still work? And then CSS was just, even with Tailwind, I don't.
Nobody likes CSS.
Yeah, I know, right? And it's like, oh, you use Tailwind, and it's like, well, that helps me if I knew what I was supposed to be doing anyways. But like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to even be trying here. So, okay, well, let's do this real quick then. So, let me go to. Yeah, oops. What was the URL that I had started there? It was, oh, that's because I don't have it running. There we go. There we go. So yeah, Red Notebook Manager, and this is where am I still sharing or I'm not sharing? I think I'm still sharing. I'm still sharing. Okay. This is where I didn't do any of the boosting that Brendan had talked about, where you could do a lot more of the spa type feel by doing that. It was mostly focused on swapping out different forms and doing those types of things. So this is just a notebook manager. So we have new notebooks here, a new button, and then this no notebooks found. And what you can see back here is we went ahead and we got the notebooks URL. And so going into our handler here, our handlers, we have, this is a notebook, and if you're not familiar with Qi, I mounted the notebooks as a sub router. So this isn't about Qi, but so if we get the root, we go ahead and use our service to get a list of notebooks. We pass those notebooks to the home component, and then we tell it to serve the HTTP. If we go in here, we've got our home component, and basically it's the body, the section, all of those types of things. I had a header function because I didn't want to keep writing the header, and that's actually in the index, and that's where we basically just bring in our head, our title, our tailwind, and our HTMX. But the interesting thing here is this is where you start having these HX attributes, right? So in our section here, we have a target of new note, and when you click the button, it's going to essentially get the notebooks, the new notebooks. It's going to make that call, and it's going to target the new note div. So if we look down into our notebooks, I've embedded that new note div. It's notebooks, not notebooks. Where is it up here? Sorry, I did not organize my code very well. I've embedded that new note div. It's just an empty div, but it's a target. When you call that, I want you to take all the HTML and I want you to stick it in here. So how that looks essentially is when you hit new, we still have no notebooks found because that's this whole thing down here, no notebooks found, but it just injected this form right above it. So now if I post a new notebook, submit, that goes away, and now we have ASDF as our notebook. The interesting thing is it actually re-renders this entire notebook. So if we go back to our handlers and we say, okay, I'm posting to notebooks, what do? I parse the form so I can go ahead and get all the form values that I need, basically the title. I create a new notebook. I get the list of notebooks from my service, and then I re-render that component. So I'm giving it back the actual HTML that I rendered, and then HTMX on the front end is just inserting that. So this is that whole concept of hypertext as the engine of state. Your state is hypertext. You're not passing JSON back and forth. I mean, whatever you want to do on the back end service, but once you send that out to the front end, it's ready to display, and it should just be replaced. That's not, it sounds really, I kind of reacted to that, like, why do I want to write HTML? But it's not that much different than thinking about it from a Go standpoint of like a CLI, right? With a CLI up here, I'm in my tables, I'm basically, I have all this formatting for writing tables to the output, and when I want to, get the notes, I go ahead and grab my notes from my service, create a new table writer, I print it all out, and then write it to the terminal. So it's a very similar concept. The interesting thing is that we are able to basically have the web type stuff directly, or web interactions, in almost as little friction as it is to create like a CLI, right? It's about the same amount of work. And that to me is what's revolutionary about me being able to use HTMX with Go, because you don't have to say, okay, well, I did my backend part, I have my gRPC service, now it's, I just hand that off to the front end, and then we've got to figure out where to host the front end. Are we going to do a static build, or where are we going to stick it? How are we going to expose that? The other thing that is kind of cool about this, if you look at what we're actually doing with this start HTTP, we're just running it in a Go routine. There is no reason why in our CLI we could not have a -- UI flag that starts this web server up and just runs it from the CLI. So now I don't even have to ship a web service. I can embed that web service directly in my CLI and just ship my CLI, and now it all just works. So the interesting part to me from the Go side of things is that it really abstracts the display, how you're displaying that away from like your backend services and how you're presenting that. But okay, anyway, so we created that new notebook. We add it. Same type of thing here with the new node. I'll just add one, and then we'll go over this field here. So this div right here, this white that's displaying the note, is a div with an ID. So if we look at that from an HTMX, in the HTMX, not the Go code, when we're rendering notes, we give the div an ID with the node ID in it. And this is, we're just rendering that directly. We passed in our native Go types, and then we're translating that into HTML. So when I want to edit this, the button that I have, I'm telling it to target this div with the response from this edit, right? This notebook notes edit. So when I click that here, what it essentially does is it just replaces everything inside that div with the response from the edit call, which if we look at the edit note call here, it's just a form. And then the interesting thing there, again, a form, but it has an ID again of the note. The input, or the button for actually saving it, we tell it to, where do we have the target there? Tell it to post, it should be on the form actually, yeah. We tell it to update our note on submit, and then target that same div. So now when we update it, what we're doing here is sending that out to the server. The server just sends us back the original note HTML, and that gets swapped out. None of the rest of the page gets rendered or re-rendered. Nothing else happens. We're just dealing with that single block of HTML.
Can the target be any valid selector, or does it have to be?
Can be any valid selector. Yes, and I shot myself in the foot multiple times with why isn't this working, when all of a sudden my form appears over here and I'm like, oh, I spelled it wrong, or oh, I did something wrong, because HTMX will put whatever, gets it back, and it shoves it wherever you tell it to. It doesn't care. And if that breaks your HTML, then that breaks your HTML. Yeah, which I think is part of why something like Temple is really helpful, because now I can just give it my node, and then I can just pull my node ID out of there, right? Like I can build unique IDs.
Doesn't guarantee that note's not also
Well, I mean, yeah, now you're talking about like what, like goods or, you know, lock, are you talking about like locking your, right, yeah, yeah. Oh, right, yes, yeah, yeah, no, that's, well, that's why I prefaced this with note, and then, so you could preface, you would have to build that out uniquely, yeah, definitely have to think about that. HTMX also has a bunch of, like, most of your CSS selectors will work, like closest and all of those types of things, so it's pretty flexible in what it allows you to do. The interesting thing with delete is how do you remove a line from a form? Because remember, when we're editing it, we're dealing with just that div, but now that goes away. How do I get rid of that in my list? What I ended up doing is essentially when you delete, the response from the delete call returns the entire current list, and then you swap the entire list out rather than just removing your particular row. There are ways, I think even the HTMX website has examples of how you can play around with just manipulating a single row in a field or in a table. And then I guess I did read online, a lot of people use other JavaScript libraries to trigger functions that will pull it away. But you can write, it's interesting too, HTMX supports writing JavaScript in attributes. So you could, in theory, say, once this happens, and have it execute JavaScript. And then you can do a lot more funky stuff. I know there's definitely it. I didn't do anything with that because I was like, that seems really, really horrible. But I'm not a front end developer, so whatever y'all do, it's not up to me. But anyways, so that's kind of the long story short with developing or using HTMX and Go. Honestly, I spent an hour on everything else, and then the HTMX web part is what really took a long time, because trying to figure out, okay, I want to insert a row to get the insert right for the form. Where am I going to put that, and how am I not going to mess this up? But then when I actually write this, I need it to show up back in the list. So it does take a little bit of planning, like how you're going to build your actual HTML, so that you make sure you've got your targets. The thing I do love about it, though, is that I could literally embed this web UI in my CLI. I didn't have to change my service. I wrote my service once, and then I exposed it through the terminal, through the web, through gRPC, and everything just worked. And the only reason it was possible to do it through the web is because I did not have to run JavaScript framework. I could just do it all natively. But yeah, okay, so that's pretty much all I've got there. Unless there's any questions or anything about the Go side of things, I'll push this up to a repo, and people can look at it and play around with it. The only other thing is you have this stupid, for your Go mod file, I don't know if you've run into the tools pattern, but since you're not technically using template or temple, but you have to have the package included in order. So yeah, so there's a little bit. It's not as, I would say it's not as mature and elegant as your gRPC tooling or your CLI tooling or stuff like that, but it's definitely come a long ways, and it's definitely far enough that if you want to use it for just simple stuff, it works. It can work really, really well. But yeah, that's it. That's me.